The room fell silent as Colonel Patricia Hendricks held up a leather-bound document that would change everything. My sister Rebecca sat frozen in her chair, her face pale as she stared at the official seal of the National War College embossed on the cover. Just 30 minutes earlier, she had called me a fraud in front of our entire extended family, claiming I was nothing but a desk jockey pretending to be a real soldier. Now, the Dean of Strategic Studies was about to reveal a truth that would shatter everything she thought she knew about my military service. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. The whole mess started 3 weeks before my nephew Tyler's high school graduation party. Rebecca had been planning this elaborate celebration for months, inviting everyone from distant cousins to old family friends. She always did this, turned every milestone into a production where she could play the perfect host and show off her suburban paradise in Westfield, Connecticut. I should have known trouble was brewing when she called me that Tuesday evening. Her voice had that particular edge it gets when she's building up to something big. "Michael, I need to ask you something, and I want a straight answer," she said without any pleasantries. "Tyler's been telling his friends that his uncle is some kind of military strategist. He's making it sound like you're this big shot at the Pentagon or something." I was sitting in my small apartment in Arlington, Virginia, still in my ACUs from another long day at my desk job. The irony wasn't lost on me. "Rebecca, I work in strategic planning. It's not that complicated." "See, that's what I'm talking about. Strategic planning sounds so vague. What do you actually do all day? Because from what I can tell, you've never deployed anywhere dangerous, you've never been in combat, and you spend your time shuffling papers in some office building. Yet Tyler thinks you're writing battle plans or something." The frustration in her voice was familiar. Rebecca had never understood the military, and she'd made it clear from the day I enlisted that she thought I was wasting my potential. She wanted me to go to business school, get an MBA, and join her husband Derek in his accounting firm. A nice, safe, respectable career that she could explain to her neighbors without any confusion. "It's not about shuffling papers, Becca. The work I do, don't call me Becca. And please, just be honest with me. Are you embarrassed about what you actually do? Because there's nothing wrong with having a desk job. But don't let Tyler build up these fantasy stories about his uncle the war hero when you're really just, support staff." Support staff. The words hit harder than they should have. I'd heard variations of this my entire 8-year career. From civilians who couldn't understand that modern warfare required more than just boots on the ground. From combat veterans who sometimes looked down on anyone who hadn't been in a firefight, and now from my own sister. "Rebecca, I'm not embarrassed about my job. But it's also not something I can discuss in detail. There are security clearances involved, and, oh, come on. Security clearances? Now you sound like some spy movie. Look, Michael, I love you, but I also know you. You were never the type to charge up hills or kick down doors. You were always the quiet one, the one with his nose in books. There's nothing wrong with that, but let's not pretend you're something you're not." After we hung up, I sat in my kitchen for a long time, staring at the stack of classified documents I'd brought home to review. 3 separate war game scenarios that I'd spent the last 6 months developing. Contingency plans for conflicts that hopefully would never happen, but if they did, might determine the outcome for thousands of soldiers and civilians. Rebecca had no idea that her paper-shuffling brother had spent the previous weekend in a secure facility, briefing generals on strategic options for a potential crisis in the South China Sea, but I couldn't tell her any of that. The classification levels on my work meant that even confirming what I did for a living could land me in federal prison. So instead, I had to listen to my sister dismiss 8 years of my life as playing pretend. The situation got worse over the next 2 weeks. Rebecca started making little comments during our phone conversations, always framed as concern for Tyler's unrealistic expectations about military life. She worried that I was giving him the wrong impression about what service meant. She didn't want him getting inflated ideas about following in my footsteps. Then came the family group chat incident. Our cousin Jennifer had posted a photo from her daughter's college graduation, mentioning how proud she was that her daughter was considering joining the Peace Corps. Rebecca immediately jumped in with a long message about how important it was to serve others in meaningful ways, and how some forms of service are more genuine than others. She didn't mention me by name, but everyone knew what she was implying. Our Aunt Margaret tried to defuse the tension by saying that all service was valuable, but Rebecca doubled down. She wrote a paragraph about how real sacrifice meant putting yourself in danger for others, not sitting safely behind a desk while other people do the hard work. I didn't respond to the group chat, but I felt every word like a physical blow. The worst part was that I couldn't defend myself without violating my oath. The work I did was classified at levels that most people didn't even know existed. I couldn't tell them about the simulations I ran, the strategic assessments I wrote, or the briefings I gave to senior leadership. I couldn't explain that my desk job involved planning operations that could affect global stability. Tyler called me 2 days before his graduation party. He was 18, about to start college, and full of questions about military service. His voice was excited as he talked about possibly joining ROTC, maybe following a path similar to mine. Uncle Mike, Mom keeps saying weird things about your job. She makes it sound like you're not really a soldier or something. But that's not true, right? I mean, you wear the uniform, you have rank, you work for the army. What's her problem? How do you explain to an 18-year-old that his mother's problem is with something she doesn't understand? How do you tell him that there are aspects of military service that don't fit into neat categories of hero or support staff? Tyler, your mom loves you, and she loves me. She just worries that you might have unrealistic expectations about military life. It's not all excitement and adventure. A lot of it is exactly what she says: desk work, planning, preparation. The unglamorous stuff that nobody makes movies about. But it's important, right? The stuff you do matters? I thought about the document I'd finished the week before. A strategic assessment of potential conflict scenarios in Eastern Europe that would be briefed to the Joint Chiefs within the month. I thought about the late nights spent modeling logistics chains and supply routes, the endless revisions to operational timelines, the careful balance of considering every variable that could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. Yeah, Tyler. It matters. The graduation party was scheduled for Saturday afternoon at Rebecca's house. She'd rented tables and chairs, hired a catering service, and invited about 50 people. I almost didn't go. The thought of spending an entire afternoon deflecting comments about my office job while watching Rebecca play the role of concerned sister was almost too much to bear, but Tyler deserved to have his family there, and despite everything, Rebecca was still my sister. So I put on my dress blues, something I rarely did for family events, and drove to Connecticut. The first few hours went smoothly. I talked to relatives I hadn't seen in months, congratulated Tyler on his graduation and his acceptance to State University, and tried to stay in the background. Rebecca was in full hostess mode, making sure everyone had food and drinks, orchestrating group photos, and generally running the show. The trouble started when our Uncle Frank, a Vietnam veteran, began telling stories about his service. Frank had served 2 tours as an infantry soldier, and his stories were always riveting: helicopter insertions, jungle patrols, firefights with enemy forces. Real soldier stories, the kind that made everyone lean in and listen. After Frank finished a particularly dramatic account of a night ambush, Rebecca's husband Derek raised his beer and said, "Now that's what I call military service. Real soldiers doing real work in real danger." There was an awkward pause as everyone absorbed the implication. Several people glanced at me, wondering how I'd respond. I just nodded and took a sip of my beer, hoping the moment would pass, but Rebecca wasn't done. "You know what, Derek?" Rebecca's voice cut through the pleasant afternoon chatter like a blade. "I think it's time we had an honest conversation about military service." The backyard fell quiet. Conversation stopped mid-sentence, and even the kids playing on the swing set seemed to sense the shift in atmosphere. I felt my stomach drop as I recognized the look on my sister's face, the same expression she'd worn when we were children. And she was about to tell our parents about something I'd done wrong. "Some people," she continued, setting down her wine glass with deliberate precision, "like to wear the uniform and collect the benefits, but they've never actually put themselves in harm's way. They've never made real sacrifices." Our cousin David, who'd been laughing at one of Frank's stories, suddenly found his potato salad fascinating. Aunt Margaret started gathering empty plates with unnecessary urgency. Everyone knew this was aimed at me, but nobody wanted to get caught in the crossfire. Tyler looked confused, glancing between his mother and me. "Mom, what are you talking about?" "I'm talking about the difference between real soldiers and people who just play dress up." Rebecca's voice was getting louder, more confident. She had an audience now, and she was warming to her theme. "Your Uncle Michael has been letting you believe he's some kind of military strategist, some important figure in the Pentagon. But the truth is, he's never even been deployed. He's never left the United States for his job. He sits in an office in Virginia and pushes papers around." The accusation hung in the air like smoke. I could feel everyone's eyes on me, waiting for my response. Frank cleared his throat uncomfortably. Derek shifted in his chair, looking like he wished he'd never made his comment about real soldiers. "Michael does important work," Aunt Margaret said quietly, trying to defuse the situation. "All military service is valuable." "Is it, though?" Rebecca stood up now, pacing slightly as she gained momentum. Is it really serving your country when you've never risked anything? When you've never sacrificed anything? Michael graduated from college with a degree in political science. He could have gone to law school, business school, could have made something of himself in the civilian world. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. Instead, he chose the easy path: guaranteed paycheck, government benefits, and a fancy title that makes him sound important. Rebecca, that's enough. I finally found my voice, but it came out quieter than I intended. No, Michael, it's not enough. Because my son looks up to you. He thinks you're this brilliant military mind, this strategic genius. He wants to follow in your footsteps, and I can't let him waste his potential the way you wasted yours. The words hit like physical blows. Tyler's face went red with embarrassment. Several relatives started making excuses to leave, suddenly remembering appointments they had to keep. The party was disintegrating in real time. You want to know what your uncle really does? Rebecca turned to address Tyler directly. He writes reports. He attends meetings. He creates PowerPoint presentations. He's basically a government bureaucrat in a military costume. Frank, who'd been quiet during the entire exchange, finally spoke up. Rebecca, you're out of line. Am I? Uncle Frank, you served 2 tours in Vietnam. You earned your stripes in actual combat. You have the right to wear that uniform with pride. But what has Michael done? What has he sacrificed? What gives him the right to call himself a soldier? I stood up, my hands shaking with anger and humiliation. I don't have to justify my service to you or anyone else. See? He can't even defend what he does because there's nothing to defend. It's all smoke and mirrors, all vague references to classified work and strategic planning. If it were really important, if it really mattered, he'd be able to talk about some of it. But he can't, because there's nothing there. Tyler looked like he wanted to disappear. Mom, please stop. No, Tyler. You need to hear this. Your uncle has been living a lie, and I won't let you get caught up in it. Military service means something. It means sacrifice, courage, putting your life on the line for your country. It doesn't mean sitting in a comfortable office building in suburban Virginia, collecting a government paycheck while other people do the real work. Derek finally tried to intervene. Honey, maybe we should. Don't honey me, Derek. I've been watching this charade for 8 years. 8 years of watching my brother pretend to be something he's not. 8 years of him letting our nephew believe in fairy tales about military glory and strategic importance. She turned back to me, her voice rising to a level that probably carried to the neighbors. You know what the worst part is, Michael? The worst part is that you've started believing your own lies. You actually think what you do matters. You actually think you're contributing something meaningful to national defense. The backyard was almost empty now. Most of the relatives had fled, taking their congratulations to Tyler and their awkward goodbyes with them. Only the immediate family remained: Rebecca, Derek, Tyler, Frank, and a few others who were too stunned to move. I've done some research, Rebecca continued, and my blood went cold. I know people in government contracting, people who work with the Pentagon. I asked around about strategic planning positions, about what people in your type of job actually do. And you know what I found out? She pulled out her phone, scrolling through what looked like screenshots. Strategic planning analysts. That's your official job title, isn't it? 90% of them are civilians. 90%. The military positions are mostly administrative, coordinating between departments, formatting reports, scheduling meetings. Glorified secretaries with security clearances. Tyler was staring at the ground now, his graduation party completely forgotten. I wanted to defend myself, wanted to explain that her research had missed the classified levels of strategic planning. The work that required military training and clearance levels that most civilians could never obtain. But every word I might have said was locked behind walls of classification that I couldn't breach. You're embarrassing yourself, Rebecca. Frank's voice was sharp now. And you're embarrassing your son on what should be one of the happiest days of his life. I'm protecting my son from following a path that leads nowhere. Michael isn't a strategist, he's not a military leader, he's not contributing to national defense in any meaningful way. He's a clerk. A very well-paid, very well-dressed clerk. She turned to face me directly, her voice dropping to a more personal level. And you know what the saddest part is? You're smart enough to have been anything you wanted. You could have been a lawyer, a businessman, a real leader in some field that actually matters. Instead, you chose to hide behind a uniform and pretend that your mediocrity is patriotism. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the children had stopped playing, sensing the adult drama unfolding around them. Derek looked like he wanted to sink into the ground. Tyler's eyes were bright with unshed tears. I looked around at what remained of my family, saw the mixture of embarrassment, pity, and awkward sympathy on their faces. Nobody was going to defend me. Nobody was going to call Rebecca out for her cruelty. They all probably agreed with her, at least partially. "You're right about one thing," I said finally, my voice steady despite the rage boiling inside me. "I can't tell you what I really do. I can't defend myself with specifics. I can't prove to you that my work matters." Rebecca's face showed a flash of victory. She thought I was conceding her point. "But I can tell you this," I continued. "There are aspects of military service that don't fit into your neat categories of heroic combat veteran or useless desk jockey. There are people who serve their country in ways that will never make the evening news, never get recognition, never be understood by civilians who think military service only counts if it involves getting shot at." "More vague nonsense," Rebecca said dismissively. "More smoke and mirrors." That's when I made the decision that would change everything. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the number I was looking for. "What are you doing?" Derek asked nervously. "I'm calling Colonel Patricia Hendricks," I said. "She's the Dean of Strategic Studies at the National War College. She's also my former supervisor." Rebecca laughed, but it sounded forced. "Oh, please? You're going to call some colonel to come rescue you from your mean sister?" "Actually," I said. "Already dialing, I'm going to ask her to bring something that might interest you. Something that might help explain what I've been doing for the past 3 years." The phone rang twice before Colonel Hendricks answered. "Major Thompson? This is unexpected. Aren't you at a family gathering?" "Yes, ma'am. I'm sorry to bother you on a Saturday, but I have an unusual request." "Ma'am, I need to ask a favor that's going to sound very strange," I said into the phone, acutely aware that everyone was listening to my side of the conversation. "Are you anywhere near the War College right now?" "I'm actually in my office catching up on some reading." "Why?" Rebecca was watching me with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism, clearly convinced that whatever I was doing would only make things worse for me. Tyler had moved closer, trying to hear both sides of the conversation. "There's a document in your office safe. The leather-bound copy of the Strategic Doctrine revision we completed last year. The one with all the departmental signatures." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Michael, you know I can't discuss classified materials over an unsecured line." "I'm not asking you to discuss it, ma'am. I'm asking if you could bring it somewhere. There are circumstances here that require some unusual measures." Colonel Hendricks had known me for 3 years. She'd been my direct supervisor during the most intensive period of my career, and she understood that I wasn't the type to make frivolous requests or abuse my professional relationships. "Where are you?" she asked. I gave her Rebecca's address in Westfield. "Ma'am, I know this is highly irregular, but there's a situation here involving my family that requires some kind of official clarification about my role in the strategic planning department." "Are you in some kind of trouble, Michael?" "Not legal trouble, ma'am. More like credibility trouble." Another pause. "I'll be there in an hour." "But Michael, this had better be important." "It is, ma'am." "Thank you." I ended the call and looked around at the remaining faces in Rebecca's backyard. Derek looked confused, Frank seemed intrigued, and Rebecca appeared to be calculating her next move. "So what now?" Rebecca asked. "We're supposed to wait around for some colonel to show up and tell us what a wonderful job you do filing reports." "We wait," I said simply. The next hour was excruciating. Most of the party guests had fled, leaving only the core family members and a few close friends who were too curious to leave. Rebecca spent the time cleaning up, making pointed comments about how ridiculous this whole situation was. Tyler helped her, shooting occasional glances at me that I couldn't quite read. Derek tried to make small talk with Frank about baseball, but everyone was clearly on edge. The graduation celebration had turned into something none of us had expected, and now we were all waiting for a resolution that might not come. At exactly 4:15 p.m., a black sedan pulled into Rebecca's driveway. Colonel Patricia Hendricks stepped out wearing civilian clothes, khakis and a polo shirt, but everything about her bearing screamed military officer. She was in her early 50s, with steel gray hair and the kind of posture that made even tall men stand up straighter when she entered a room. She was carrying a leather briefcase and had a serious expression that made Rebecca's confident smirk fade slightly. "Major Thompson," she said as she approached the backyard gate. Her voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Colonel Hendricks," I replied, snapping to attention out of habit despite being in civilian clothes. "Thank you for coming, ma'am." She looked around at the assembled family members, her sharp eyes taking in the tension and awkwardness that hung in the air like humidity. "Would someone like to explain to me why I drove an hour to a graduation party?" Rebecca stepped forward, and I could see her switching into the polished, professional persona she used at Derek's accounting firm's social events. "Colonel, I'm Michael's sister, Rebecca Martinez. I'm sorry you had to drive all the way out here. But my brother seems to think that you can settle some kind of family disagreement about his military service." "What kind of disagreement?" This was the moment Rebecca had been building toward all afternoon. She straightened her shoulders and looked Colonel Hendricks directly in the eye. "I've been trying to help my son understand the difference between real military service and administrative positions that just happen to require a uniform. Michael has been allowing my son to believe that he's some kind of strategic military genius, when the reality is that he works in an office job that could just as easily be performed by a civilian." Colonel Hendricks' expression didn't change, but I caught a slight tightening around her eyes. "I see. And you believe Major Thompson has been misrepresenting his duties?" "I don't believe it, I know it. I've done research. Strategic planning analysts are essentially glorified clerks. They format reports, attend meetings, and coordinate between departments. It's important work, I'm sure, but it's not the kind of strategic military leadership that my brother has been implying." "Your research," Colonel Hendricks said slowly, "covered the full scope of strategic planning positions in the Department of Defense?" "Well, the publicly available information, obviously. But that's my point. If Michael's work was genuinely important to national security, there would be some way to verify it, some way to demonstrate its significance." Tyler was watching this exchange like a tennis match, his head turning back and forth between his mother and the colonel. Frank had moved closer, clearly fascinated by this unexpected turn of events. Colonel Hendricks set her briefcase down on one of Rebecca's patio tables. "Mrs. Martinez, may I ask what your professional background is?" "I have an MBA from UConn and I work in business development for my husband's accounting firm." "So you have experience in organizational management and strategic planning in the business sector?" "Yes, actually. I do." Rebecca's voice gained confidence. She thought she was being asked to establish her credentials to evaluate Michael's work. "Then you understand the difference between operational planning and strategic doctrine development?" The question caught Rebecca off guard. "Well, strategic doctrine would be higher-level policy, I suppose." "Higher-level policy," Colonel Hendricks repeated. "Mrs. Martinez, what do you think strategic doctrine means in a military context?" Rebecca glanced at me, then back at the colonel. "Planning for military operations? Developing strategies for potential conflicts?" "Close, but not quite complete. Strategic doctrine is the fundamental framework that guides how an entire military organization approaches conflict. It's the theoretical foundation that informs everything from individual unit tactics to multi-theater war planning." She opened her briefcase and pulled out the leather-bound document I'd asked her to bring. Even from several feet away, I could see the official seals and classification markings on the cover. "This document," Colonel Hendricks continued, "is the current strategic doctrine for the United States Army's approach to asymmetric warfare and multi-domain operations. It was adopted by the Army staff 2 years ago and is now taught at every war college and command school in our system." Rebecca was staring at the document, but I could see confusion in her eyes. She didn't understand where this was leading. "Mrs. Martinez, your brother didn't just contribute to this doctrine. He wrote it." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the neighborhood sounds seemed to fade away. Rebecca's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, and then something that might have been fear. "I don't understand," she said quietly. "Major Thompson spent 18 months developing the theoretical framework that became our current strategic doctrine. He researched historical precedents, analyzed modern conflict patterns, and synthesized approaches from multiple military theorists into a coherent operational philosophy. This document represents his work." Colonel Hendricks held up the bound volume. "Every strategic planning officer in the Army studies this doctrine. Every war college student learns these principles. When our generals make decisions about force deployment, resource allocation, and operational priorities, they're using frameworks that your brother created." Tyler's mouth was hanging open. Derek looked like he'd been hit with a hammer. Frank was nodding slowly, a look of understanding spreading across his face. "But that's impossible," Rebecca said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's never? I mean, his official job title is Major, Strategic Planning Division, because that's the administrative category that covers his actual function. Mrs. Martinez, your brother isn't a strategic planning analyst. He's a strategic doctrine developer. There are exactly 11 people in the entire Army with his specific qualifications and security clearance level." The colonel opened the document to a page near the front and turned it so Rebecca could see. There, in official military typography, was a signature block that read, Primary Author, Major Michael Thompson, Strategic Planning Division, Office of the Deputy Chief of Staff. The reason your brother can't talk about his work isn't because it's unimportant, Colonel Hendricks continued. It's because it's so important that detailed knowledge of our current strategic thinking could compromise national security if it fell into the wrong hands. Rebecca was staring at the signature page like it was written in a foreign language. But he never deployed. Mrs. Martinez, do you think the people who designed the atomic bomb were less important because they never carried rifles into battle? The comparison hit like a physical blow. Rebecca actually took a step backward. Your brother's work directly influences how we deploy the soldiers who do carry rifles into battle. When a general decides how to structure a mission in Afghanistan, or how to position forces in Eastern Europe, those decisions are informed by strategic principles that your brother developed. She closed the document and returned it to her briefcase. Mrs. Martinez, I understand that military service can be confusing for civilians. Combat roles are easier to understand because they're more visible. But wars are won by people who think, as much as by people who fight. Your brother is one of the people who thinks. The weight of Colonel Hendricks' words settled over the backyard like a heavy blanket. Rebecca stood motionless, her face cycling through emotions I'd never seen before, shame, disbelief, and something that looked like genuine horror at what she'd done. Tyler was the first to break the silence. Uncle Mike, you wrote the Army's strategy book? Colonel Hendricks turned to him with a slight smile. Not just a strategy book, son. The strategy framework. Think of it this way, if the Army were a corporation, your uncle wrote the business plan that every department uses to make decisions. But why couldn't he tell us? Tyler's voice was small, confused. Because, the colonel explained patiently, if our enemies knew exactly how we think about warfare, they could predict our moves. Your uncle's work is classified at levels that require extensive background investigations just to access. Most generals don't have clearance to see all of it. Derek, who had been silent through the entire revelation, finally found his voice. Colonel, are you saying that Michael is important? Like, strategically important to the military? Mr. Martinez, I'm saying that your brother-in-law's work influences decisions made at the Pentagon, the White House, and allied military commands around the world. When NATO plans joint operations, they use frameworks he developed. When Congress debates military budget allocations, they're briefed on strategic priorities that he helped define. Rebecca suddenly sat down heavily in one of the patio chairs, her face pale. I called him a clerk, she whispered. You called him worse than that, Frank said quietly. The Vietnam veteran had been watching the entire exchange with growing intensity. Rebecca, you accused him of lying about his service. You said he was a fraud. I didn't know, Rebecca said, but her voice lacked conviction. Even she seemed to realize how weak that defense sounded. Colonel Hendricks studied Rebecca for a moment before speaking again. Mrs. Martinez, may I ask you something? Rebecca nodded mutely. When you did your research into strategic planning positions, did you consider that there might be levels of classification you weren't accessing? Did you think that perhaps the publicly available information might not tell the complete story? I thought if it was really important, there would be some way to verify it. You thought wrong. The colonel's voice was firm but not unkind. The most important military work is often the most invisible. The people who plan our responses to potential threats, who develop our strategic thinking, who create the frameworks that keep our soldiers alive, their work is classified specifically because it's so vital. She gestured toward me. Your brother has spent 8 years developing expertise that makes him one of the most valuable strategic minds in the current military. He's been personally briefed by generals, consulted by policymakers, and his recommendations have influenced decisions affecting millions of people. And he's done all of this while letting his own family believe he was just pushing papers because his oath of service required him to protect information that could affect national security. Tyler looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before, a mixture of awe and apology. Uncle Mike, I'm sorry. I'm sorry I let Mom make you feel bad about your job. Tyler, you didn't do anything wrong, I said. This isn't your fault. But I could have defended you. I could have told her to stop. Frank stepped forward, his weathered face serious. Son, your uncle couldn't defend himself because of his duty to his country. That's what real soldiers do, they put their mission before their personal comfort, even when it costs them something important. He turned to look at Rebecca, and his voice carried the weight of his own military experience. Rebecca, I served 2 tours in Vietnam. I saw combat, I lost friends, I came home with scars. But I never wrote doctrine that influenced how the entire Army thinks about warfare. Your brother's contribution to military service is something I could never have achieved. Rebecca was crying now, quiet tears that she wiped away with trembling hands. Michael, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I looked at my sister, really looked at her, and saw something I hadn't expected. Beyond the shame and embarrassment, I saw fear. Fear that she'd damaged something irreparable between us, fear that her son would never look at her the same way, fear that she'd revealed something ugly about herself that couldn't be taken back. Rebecca, I said softly, I forgive you. No. She said, shaking her head. No, you can't just forgive this. I humiliated you in front of our whole family. I called you a fraud. I said terrible things about your service, about your sacrifice. I was cruel and ignorant and you were trying to protect Tyler, I interrupted. You were wrong about the facts, but you weren't wrong about wanting your son to have realistic expectations about military life. Colonel Hendricks watched this exchange with interest. Mrs. Martinez, may I offer you some perspective? Rebecca nodded, still wiping her eyes. Your concerns about military service aren't unreasonable. It is a demanding life, with sacrifices that civilians often don't understand. Your worry about your son having unrealistic expectations shows that you care about his future. You just didn't have complete information about what military service can look like. She opened her briefcase again and pulled out another document, this one less official looking. This is a letter of commendation that Major Thompson received last year from the Secretary of Defense. It's unclassified, so I can share it with you. She handed the letter to Rebecca, who read it with growing amazement. It says here that his work on strategic doctrine was invaluable to national defense and represents the finest tradition of military intellectual achievement. Your brother, Colonel Hendricks continued, represents a type of military service that doesn't get movies made about it. He's never been in a firefight, never jumped out of an airplane, never kicked down doors. But he's protected more soldiers and influenced more military outcomes than most combat veterans ever will. Tyler moved closer to read the letter over his mother's shoulder. Mom, look at this. It's signed by the Secretary of Defense. The actual Secretary of Defense knows who Uncle Mike is. Rebecca handed the letter back to Colonel Hendricks with shaking hands. I feel sick. I feel literally sick about what I said. Mrs. Martinez, the colonel said gently, the best way to honor your brother's service now is to learn from this experience. Military service comes in many forms, and some of the most important contributions happen in ways that the public never sees. Derek, who had been unusually quiet, finally spoke up. Michael, why didn't you ever correct us? I mean, couldn't you have said something to give us a better idea of what you actually do? I thought about that question for a moment. Because the moment I start explaining how important my work is, I sound like I'm bragging. And the moment I try to give specifics, I risk violating my security clearance. It's easier to just let people think what they want to think. But you let us diminish your service, Rebecca said. You let me make you feel small. Rebecca, I took an oath to protect classified information, even if it meant protecting it from my own family. That oath doesn't come with exceptions for family gatherings or hurt feelings. Colonel Hendricks nodded approvingly. That's exactly the kind of integrity that made Major Thompson perfect for his position. He puts duty before personal comfort, mission before ego. She looked around at the assembled family members. I hope you understand now why I drove an hour to attend a graduation party. Major Thompson's reputation, both professionally and personally, deserved to be defended. Frank walked over and extended his hand to me. Michael, I owe you an apology. Too. I should have spoken up earlier, should have told Rebecca she was out of line. Frank, you don't owe me anything. Yes, I do. We all do. He glanced meaningfully at the others. We let you stand alone while someone attacked your honor and your service. That's not what family does. Tyler suddenly stepped forward and hugged me, something he hadn't done since he was much younger. Uncle Mike, I want you to know that I still want to follow in your footsteps. Maybe not the same job, but the same kind of service. The kind where you do important work even if nobody knows about it. Rebecca let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. Now I'm worried for completely different reasons. Why? Tyler asked. Because now I know that military service can be even more important and demanding than I thought. Now I'm worried that you'll be too good at it, and I'll spend the rest of my life not knowing what you're really doing to serve your country. Colonel Hendricks smiled at that. Mrs. Martinez, that might be the most appropriate worry a military parent can have. She checked her watch and picked up her briefcase. I should head back. Major Thompson, I'll see you Monday morning. We have the quarterly strategic assessment briefing to prepare. Yes, ma'am. She turned to Rebecca one more time. Mrs. Martinez? Your brother is scheduled to be promoted to lieutenant colonel next year. When that happens, he'll be one of the youngest officers ever to reach that rank in strategic planning. You should be very proud of him. After Colonel Hendricks left, the Backyard fell into a different kind of silence. The tension was gone, replaced by something more complicated, a mixture of relief, embarrassment, and the delicate work of rebuilding relationships that had been damaged. Rebecca sat quietly for a long time, staring at the spot where the colonel had been standing. Finally, she looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes. Michael, how do I fix this? How do I fix what I did to you, to us, to this family? I sat down across from her, thinking about everything that had happened, everything that had been said. Rebecca, you fix it by remembering this moment. You fix it by understanding that there are things about military service, about sacrifice, about duty, that can't be measured by the standards you're used to. And you fix it by trusting that when someone you love chooses to serve, they might be serving in ways you can't see or understand. Tyler sat down next to his mother. Mom, Uncle Mike never bragged about his job. He never made me think he was a hero. He just answered my questions and treated my interest in military service seriously. Maybe that should have told you something about his character. Rebecca nodded slowly. It should have. It should have told me everything I needed to know. As the sun began to set over Westfield, Connecticut, the graduation party that had started as a celebration, turned into a crisis, and ended as a revelation, finally began to wind down. But the real celebration, the recognition of service, sacrifice, and the quiet heroism of duty performed without recognition, was just beginning. 3 months after Tyler's graduation party, I was sitting in my office at the Pentagon when my secure phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but the area code was from the Pacific Northwest, specifically, Joint Base Lewis McChord in Washington State. Major Thompson, this is Colonel Sarah Mitchell, 4th Infantry Division. I hope you have a few minutes to talk. Of course, ma'am. How can I help you? Major, I'm calling because we just completed a training exercise using the asymmetric warfare protocols from the strategic doctrine you developed. I wanted you to know that your framework probably saved lives today. I leaned back in my chair, intrigued. Could you elaborate on that, ma'am? We ran a simulation based on intelligence suggesting a potential terrorist cell operating near one of our forward operating bases in Eastern Europe. Instead of using traditional sweep and clear tactics, we applied your multi-domain approach, integrated cyber reconnaissance, cultural liaison protocols, and graduated response matrices. She paused, and I could hear papers rustling in the background. Major, we identified and neutralized the threat without firing a single shot. More importantly, we did it without alienating the local population or creating the kind of collateral damage that usually generates more insurgents than it eliminates. That's exactly what the doctrine was designed to achieve, I said. How did the exercise officers respond to the approach? That's the interesting part. Initially, there was pushback from some of the more traditional commanders. They wanted to go in hard and fast, use overwhelming force to eliminate the threat quickly. But when we showed them the long-term consequences modeling that your doctrine requires, they understood why the graduated approach was more effective. After I hung up, I sat in my office thinking about the conversation. This was the kind of validation that made 8 years of working in shadows worthwhile. Real soldiers, in real situations, using frameworks I developed to accomplish their missions more effectively and safely. But what struck me most was something Colonel Mitchell had mentioned almost in passing: the resistance from traditional commanders who wanted to use overwhelming force. It reminded me of Rebecca's assumption that military service only counted if it involved direct confrontation and physical courage. That evening, I drove to Westfield for dinner. Rebecca had been making an effort to rebuild our relationship, inviting me over regularly and genuinely trying to understand my perspective on military service. It wasn't easy for either of us. Her guilt over the graduation party incident was still raw, and I was still processing the hurt from her public humiliation of my service. When I arrived, Tyler was in the living room working on college applications. He looked up as I came in, his face brightening. Uncle Mike. Perfect timing. I'm working on my essay for the ROTC scholarship application, and I wanted to run something by you. What's the topic? They want me to write about what military leadership means to me. I was thinking about writing about you, about what happened at my graduation party. Rebecca, who had been setting the table in the dining room, froze. Tyler, I don't think. No, Mom, hear me out. Tyler turned to face both of us. I want to write about how real leadership sometimes means doing the right thing even when nobody understands what you're doing or why you're doing it. Uncle Mike couldn't defend himself because his duty to his country was more important than his reputation with his family. He pulled up his laptop and began reading from his draft. I wrote, true military leadership isn't about commanding respect through demonstrations of force or visible heroism. It's about maintaining integrity and commitment to mission even when those around you question your value or dedication. My Uncle taught me that some of the most important military service happens in silence, protected by classification levels that prevent the recognition most people need to feel validated in their work. Rebecca sat down heavily in her chair. Tyler, you don't need to write about that day. You don't need to memorialize my mistakes. Mom, it's not about your mistakes. It's about Uncle Mike's character. The scholarship committee wants to know what kind of leader I want to become. I want to become the kind of leader who puts mission before ego, duty before recognition. I looked at the essay draft on Tyler's screen. His writing was mature, thoughtful, and surprisingly insightful for an 18-year-old. But more than that, it demonstrated that he understood something about military service that had taken me years to fully grasp. Tyler, can I suggest a small revision? Of course. Instead of focusing on what happened at your graduation party, maybe focus on what you learned about different types of military service. Write about how you came to understand that some soldiers serve by carrying rifles, others serve by flying planes, others serve by developing the strategies that keep all of them safer and more effective. Tyler nodded, already typing notes. So, it's about the diversity of military roles and the importance of intellectual contribution to national defense. Exactly. And more than that, it's about understanding that military service is ultimately about something bigger than individual recognition or personal glory. Rebecca had been listening to this conversation with growing emotion. Finally, she spoke up. Michael, can I ask you something that I've been wondering about for months? Sure. That day, when I was attacking your service, when I was calling you a fraud, did you ever consider breaking your security clearance to defend yourself? Did you ever think about just telling us what you really did? I thought about her question carefully. Honestly? For about 30 seconds, I considered it. When you were talking about Tyler having unrealistic expectations, when you said I was wasting my potential, I wanted to tell you about the briefings I'd given to general officers, about the strategic assessments that had influenced policy decisions. But you didn't. No, I didn't. Because the moment I start using classified information to defend my ego, I become the kind of person who shouldn't have access to that information in the first place. Derek, who had been quietly listening from the kitchen, joined the conversation. Michael, I have to admit, I still don't fully understand what you do. Even after Colonel Hendricks explained it, the concept of strategic doctrine development is pretty abstract to me. Derek, think about it this way. You're an accountant, right? You understand business strategy, how companies plan for growth, manage resources, respond to competition. Sure. Military strategic doctrine is similar, except instead of planning how to compete in markets, we're planning how to deter conflicts, how to respond to threats, how to project power in ways that actually prevent wars rather than just win them. Tyler looked up from his laptop. So Uncle Mike, when you developed the asymmetric warfare framework, you were basically creating a playbook for how the Army should think about dealing with unconventional threats. That's a good way to put it. I analyzed historical conflicts, studied successful and unsuccessful approaches to asymmetric warfare, and synthesized that research into principles that commanders could apply to specific situations. And that's what Colonel Hendricks meant when she said your work influences decisions at every level? Right. When a general has to decide how to approach a potential conflict, when a policymaker has to recommend force deployment options, when Allied military leaders are planning joint operations, they're all using frameworks that grew out of that research. Rebecca had been following this explanation intently. Michael, I think I'm starting to understand something that I missed before. Your work isn't just academic research. It's research that gets used by people making life and death decisions. That's exactly right. So when you say your work is classified to protect national security, you don't mean that it's classified because it's embarrassing or because it might be criticized. You mean it's classified because if enemies knew how we think about strategy, they could use that knowledge against us. And against the soldiers who have to implement those strategies, I added. The frameworks I develop are ultimately about keeping American soldiers alive while accomplishing their missions effectively. Tyler saved his essay draft and closed his laptop. You know what's crazy? I used to think that intelligence and strategy were somehow less important than physical courage. Like, being smart was valuable, but being brave was what really mattered in military service. And now? Derek asked. Now I think they're inseparable. You can't be truly brave without intelligence, because courage without wisdom is just recklessness. And you can't develop effective strategy without understanding what you're asking soldiers to risk their lives for. Rebecca stood up and walked to the window, looking out at her perfectly manicured suburban backyard. You know what the worst part of this whole experience has been for me? Not the embarrassment, not the guilt, although those have been terrible. The worst part is realizing how much I didn't know about something I thought I understood. She turned back to face us. I thought I knew what military service looked like because I'd seen movies, because I'd heard Uncle Frank's stories, because I'd read news articles about soldiers in combat. I thought I had enough information to make judgments about the value of different types of service. Rebecca, you're not the only person who's made that mistake, I said. Most civilians have a very limited understanding of how modern military operations actually work. But I'm not most civilians, Michael. I'm your sister. I should have trusted you, should have assumed that if you were dedicating your life to military service, you probably had good reasons for believing it was important work. Tyler reopened his laptop. Mom, can I read you the last paragraph of my essay? Rebecca nodded. I wrote, military leadership in the 21st century requires understanding that wars are won as much by ideas as by weapons, as much by strategic thinking as by tactical execution. The leader I want to become is someone who contributes to military effectiveness not just through personal courage, but through intellectual rigor, analytical precision, and the wisdom to develop approaches that accomplish missions while minimizing casualties on all sides. That kind of leadership requires the humility to work without recognition and the integrity to serve without applause. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Rebecca began to cry, not the tears of shame and regret that had characterized her emotions for the past 3 months, but tears that seemed to come from a deeper place of understanding and pride. Tyler, she said through her tears, that's the most mature thing I've ever heard you say. I learned it from Uncle Mike. Not from anything he said, but from watching how he handled what happened at my party. He could have gotten angry, could have walked away from our family, could have held a grudge. Instead, he forgave you and used the whole experience as a teaching moment. Derek smiled at this. Tyler, you're going to make an outstanding officer. If I'm half as good as Uncle Mike, I'll be satisfied. As I drove home that evening, I thought about the phone call from Colonel Mitchell, about Tyler's essay, about the slow process of rebuilding trust with Rebecca. The work I did would always be largely invisible, would always be misunderstood by most people who encountered it. But maybe that was okay. Maybe the real measure of military service wasn't public recognition or family understanding, but the quiet satisfaction of knowing that somewhere, soldiers were safer and more effective because of work done in shadows, protected by classification, valued by the people who mattered most. 2 years later, I stood in the auditorium at the National War College watching Tyler graduate from his first year of ROTC training. He'd earned the highest academic honors in his class and had been selected as battalion commander for his sophomore year, an almost unprecedented achievement for someone so young. Rebecca sat beside me, no longer the defensive, uncertain woman who had attacked my service at a graduation party. She'd spent the past 2 years learning about military history, reading books on strategic theory, and even attending public lectures at local colleges about national security. She wanted to understand not just my work, but the broader context of modern military service. Look at him up there, she whispered as Tyler received his leadership award. He's so confident, so focused. I can see you in him, Michael. He's his own person, Rebecca. He's going to be a better officer than I ever was. The ceremony concluded with an address from General Amanda Foster, the current Army Chief of Staff. She spoke about the evolution of military leadership, about how 21st century challenges required officers who could think strategically, adapt quickly, and lead with both courage and wisdom. After the ceremony, we joined Tyler for dinner at a restaurant near campus. He was animated, excited about his summer training assignment and the courses he'd be taking in his sophomore year. Uncle Mike, I have news, Tyler said as we ordered dessert. Professor Williams wants me to participate in a research project this fall. They're doing a historical analysis of strategic doctrine evolution since World War II. Rebecca raised an eyebrow. That sounds like it's right in your uncle's wheelhouse. Actually, Mom, that's the interesting part. Professor Williams doesn't know about Uncle Mike's work, it's all classified, but he's been studying the public impacts of recent strategic doctrine changes. He says there was a major shift in Army strategic thinking about 3 years ago that revolutionized how we approach asymmetric warfare. I kept my expression neutral, but internally I was smiling. Tyler was unknowingly going to be studying the public impacts of work I'd done in secret. The professor says this new strategic framework has been incredibly successful in reducing civilian casualties and improving mission effectiveness in recent operations. He wants to analyze what caused this shift in military thinking. Tyler, Rebecca said carefully, does your professor know that your uncle works in strategic planning? I mentioned it, but like I said, he doesn't know any details about what Uncle Mike actually does. All he knows is that there's been this remarkable improvement in strategic thinking, and he wants to understand where it came from. After dinner, Rebecca and I walked Tyler back to his dormitory. As we said our goodbyes, Tyler hugged me tightly. Uncle Mike, I know I can't know the details of your work, but I want you to know that whatever you're doing, I'm proud to be following in your footsteps. Tyler, you're not following in my footsteps. You're making your own path. That's what the best officers do. On the drive back to Westfield, Rebecca was unusually quiet. Finally, as we reached her neighborhood, she spoke. Michael, can I tell you something I've never said before? Of course. That day at Tyler's graduation party, when I called you a fraud, when I said all those terrible things, I wasn't really angry at you. I was angry at myself. What do you mean? I was angry because I'd always felt guilty about not understanding your work, not being supportive of your career choice. Instead of admitting that I didn't understand something important to you, I convinced myself that there was nothing to understand. It was easier to diminish your service than to admit my own ignorance. She parked in her driveway but made no move to get out of the car. Watching Tyler tonight, seeing how proud he is to be preparing for military service, seeing how much he's learned from your example, I realized that I wasted 8 years being resentful about something I should have been proud of. Rebecca, you don't need to. Yes, I do. Michael, you've spent your entire adult life serving your country in ways that most people will never know about or appreciate. You've done work that has literally saved lives, work that has made our military more effective and more humane. And you've done it all while enduring criticism and misunderstanding from people who should have been supporting you. She finally turned to look at me directly. I want you to know that I understand now what real strength looks like. It's not about proving yourself to other people. It's about doing what needs to be done regardless of whether anyone notices or appreciates it. 6 months later, I received a phone call that would change my career trajectory. I was being promoted to lieutenant colonel and offered a position at the Pentagon developing strategic doctrine for space-based military operations, a field so new and classified that even my family would never know it existed. As I cleaned out my office, I found a letter Tyler had written me during his sophomore year. He'd been studying leadership theory, and he wanted to share something he'd learned. Uncle Mike, the letter read, I've been thinking about what makes someone a true leader versus someone who just holds a leadership position. I think true leaders are people who influence outcomes without needing to control recognition. They're people who understand that the most important victories are often invisible to the people who benefit from them. You taught me that leadership isn't about getting credit for success. It's about accepting responsibility for making success possible, even when other people get to celebrate the victories you made possible. I don't know if I'll ever have the kind of impact you've had on military strategy and effectiveness. But I know that whatever contribution I make to military service, I want to make it with the same integrity and humility you've shown. As I drove away from the Pentagon that evening, I thought about Tyler's letter, about Rebecca's transformation, about Colonel Mitchell's phone call describing lives saved by strategic frameworks I developed in secret. The work would continue to be invisible, would continue to be misunderstood by most people who encountered it. But that was the nature of service, not just military service, but any work that contributed to something larger than individual recognition. Rebecca had been wrong about many things that day at Tyler's graduation party. But she'd been right about one thing: military service does require sacrifice. She just hadn't understood that sometimes the greatest sacrifice isn't risking your life in combat, but accepting that your contribution to protecting other people's lives might never be fully known or appreciated. That was a sacrifice I'd been making for 8 years, and one I'd continue making for as long as my country needed strategic thinking done in shadows. Protected by classification, measured not by recognition but by the quiet satisfaction of work that mattered. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.